So, as I mentioned, many of the Kalam texts have a section on physics. They actually talk about physics before they talk about God. What physics did they use? Well, up to a certain point, I would say up to 1100, maybe up to 1200, the most common physics that the Kalam thinkers believe in is atomism. So many of these Kalam theologians believed that everything in the world is made out of atoms. These are not atoms in the modern sense. Atom here is an indivisible material unit that has no qualities, so tasteless, colorless, odorless, has no qualities at all. You can't even see an atom, but it's a physical thing. And everything that exists is a body made up of atoms. And then they believe that the qualities that particular bodies have, such as color and length and width and sound and this sort of stuff, the qualities that bodies have that we perceive, even things like knowledge, emotion, these exist in bodies because of something else called accidents. So accidents are the bearers of quality, and atoms are like the material substrate of these things. Now, this is somewhat complicated, but this is their view. I'm probably not giving justice to it. But basically, they think that the whole world is bodily. It's just a bunch of bodies made out of atoms, and atoms are carrying accidents. And they think that this is always sort of in motion. At every, from one moment to another, what's happening is bodies are interacting, are moving, changing position, place, and accidents are sort of being exchanged. So when something goes from cold to hot, or hot to cold, or dry to wet, what's happening is the accidents in these bodies are changing. Some accidents are coming in, some are leaving. Even when I'm talking, that's happening. That's their physics. Probably they got it from some Greek thinkers. I'm not sure which ones. But that's the world, according to Kalam, up to a certain, in the classical period. And so they don't really have the idea of a spiritual world. So for them, even what we call the soul, according to these Kalam thinkers up to around 1200, what we call the soul, that's made of atoms as well. They think angels are made out of atoms. Everything's made out of atoms. Everything is material. It's a very materialist cosmology. But they will use this, because remember, they think everything is sort of in time, right? Everything is temporally changing. These bodies and atoms, none of that is eternal, according to them. So they used an argument, a famous argument called the Kalam cosmological argument. This argument basically, it draws on this physics here, and it says, firstly, that anything that begins to exist, anything that exists after it didn't exist, has a cause. So, the house that I'm in, it came into existence a finite time ago, and because it came into existence, it began to exist, something caused it to exist. Otherwise, it wouldn't. I began to exist, so I have a cause. So that's basically what they're saying, right? Everything that began to exist at some point, something else brought it into existence. Very sort of simple idea. Then they say that the whole world, right, this entire world of bodies, atoms, accidents, the world itself began to exist at some point. In other words, they're saying, they argued that this world, the whole physical world, which for them, that's the whole world, it has a past that is finite. So the world is not eternal. If we go back in time to the past, we'll reach a point, an end point. We will not go back in time forever. That is their second argument. So the world began at a certain point, right? Some sort of point the world began. And then the conclusion that they draw from this is, well, if the world began to exist, then the world has a cause. Something caused the world to exist when it began to exist. And that cause, it has to be an eternal cause. If the cause of the world is a temporal cause, right? If it's something that's undergoing change, then it would be subject to the same problem, that something must have brought that into existence, and then there would have to be an eternal cause. So this is called the Kalam cosmological argument. And the first question somebody might ask is, well, how do we know the world has a finite past? How do we know that the world began at this point? How do we know it just doesn't go back in time forever? So one argument that the Kalam theologians use to prove that the world has a beginning, a finite past, is this idea that if the past time of the world was infinite, right? So the world has existed for an infinite amount of time. It would mean that to reach the present time, right, to get to this present moment right now, an infinite amount of time has passed. So think about that for a second. If the world has an infinite past, right, there's no temporal beginning, our world goes back in the past, goes back into infinity, it would mean that to get from that infinite past to the present, which we are in, then that whole infinite time period has actually occurred. You might say, well, what's wrong with that? Well, according to al-Ghazali, there is no difference between saying that something has passed and that it has concluded and ended. In other words, if I say an infinite time has passed so that we're now in the present, I just said the infinite came to an end, right? The infinite has ended. So that doesn't make any sense, because something that is infinite by definition has no end. It just keeps going and going and going. And yet, we're in the present, so whatever the past that we had before the present moment, that has come and gone. But the infinite cannot come and go. Therefore, all the past time that has elapsed to reach the present, that is finite. It's not infinite. In other words, this world, according to this argument, the world that we live in, the whole physical world of time and space and bodies, that has a finite past. It has a finite past because we're now in the present and everything in the past has elapsed. That is what al-Ghazali here, who is a Kalam theologian, has argued. And this was their argument. So that confirmed, because number one, the first point, they think it's pretty intuitive. Whatever begins with this has a cause. Then by this proof against infinite time, the world must have a finite past. They don't know how long it is, but it had to have begun. And therefore, they say, there must be a cause. Right? The universe, the world has a cause. Something brought the world into existence. And according to them, this must be a pre-eternal cause, as well as it must be pre-eternal, right? So it has no beginning, and it must be post-eternal. It has no end. The cause of this world of bodies, it must be without a body. So it must be incorporeal. They go on to say that it must be powerful because, like, look at our world, everything is moving all the time, so it can only be caused by an all-powerful being. It must be knowing. They would appeal to sort of like the patterns, what we call the laws of nature, the complexity within the world. They would say, well, that shows knowledge, so the cause of the world must be knowing. It must be conscious because it created a whole world. It must have will because it created the world with many finite conditions. So you need will to sort of determine things in a concrete way, because the world could have been created any size at any time. You need will to do that. And this entity, the sort of eternal cause of the physical world, the Kalam thinkers say that this is God. And for them, for Kalam, God alone is incorporeal or spiritual and eternal. And everything that God has created is temporal and bodily. That is their view. That's the Kalam view. So God, in their view, there's no spiritual world, according to classical Kalam. There's only God who's spiritual and everything else is physical. Now, somebody might say, well, this is all very interesting, but this argument really wouldn't work anymore because we know that the physics of our world is not what these Kalam thinkers believe, right? We don't believe in atoms and accidents. We believe in particles and electrons and protons and so on. That would, of course, would be true. The argument would not work in exactly the same way. Mind you, though, this argument from infinity, the idea that the past cannot be infinite, because if it were, it would mean an infinite amount of time has passed. That argument could still work today, actually, if you really think about it. It depends on how you define time, but this argument against infinite past time, it's a purely philosophical argument. It could work. But the argument has been updated. So, they do believe that now the cause of the world, for Kalam, God, who causes the world that when it begins to exist, they also believe that God keeps recreating the world. Because remember, from three of these Kalam schools, Asharis, Hanbalis, and Maturidis, God creates all actions. So we may see bees stinging and pollen, getting pollen from flowers, and we may see people shaking hands and so on. According to many of the Kalam thinkers, God is causing these activities to happen because God is recreating atoms and accidents at every instant. This is, to understand what I'm talking about here, this is sort of like how they used to do cartoons before, you draw a cartoon, you have like this pad and you sort of flip the pages very quickly and it gives you the illusion of motion. So that's what the Kalam theologians believe about how God creates. That they think God is creating everything anew at every sort of moment in time, and because it sort of is happening so quickly, it gives us the illusion that we are moving and we're doing things. That's their viewpoint. Now, this argument that they make, Kalam cosmological argument, in their form it's outdated, but the argument has been revived by a Christian theologian named William Lane Craig. And it's worth actually, to help you understand the Kalam cosmological argument, right, to get you to take this seriously, it is helpful if I actually show you a video of the modern reconstruction of the argument. So that is what I'm going to do. I'm going to show you a video that William Lane Craig has made to present this argument in modern terms. So let's go watch the video.
Does God exist? Or is the material universe all that is, or ever was, or ever will be? One approach to answering this question is the cosmological argument. It goes like this. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore, the universe has a cause. Is the first premise true? Let's consider. Believing that something can pop into existence without a cause is more of a stretch than believing in magic. At least with magic, you've got a hat and a magician. And if something can come into being from nothing, then why don't we see this happening all the time? No, everyday experience and scientific evidence confirm our first premise. If something begins to exist, it must have a cause. But what about our second premise? Did the universe begin, or has it always existed? Atheists have typically said that the universe has been here forever. The universe is just there, and that's all. First, let's consider the second law of thermodynamics. It tells us the universe is slowly running out of usable energy, and that's the point. If the universe had been here forever, it would have run out of usable energy by now. The second law points us to a universe that has a definite beginning. This is further confirmed by a series of remarkable scientific discoveries. In 1915, Albert Einstein presented his general theory of relativity. This allowed us, for the first time, to talk meaningfully about the past history of the universe. Next, Alexander Friedman and George Lemaitre, each working with Einstein's equations, predicted that the universe is expanding. Then in 1929, Edwin Hubble measured the red shift in light from distant galaxies. This empirical evidence confirmed not only that the universe is expanding, but that it sprang into being from a single point in the finite past. It was a monumental discovery, almost beyond comprehension. However, not everyone is fond of a finite universe, so it wasn't long before alternative models popped into existence. But one by one, these models failed to stand the test of time. More recently, three leading cosmologists, Arvind Borde, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin, prove that any universe which has on average been expanding throughout its history cannot be eternal in the past, but must have an absolute beginning. This even applies to the multiverse, if there is such a thing. This means that scientists can no longer hide behind a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. Any adequate model must have a beginning, just like the standard model. It's quite plausible then that both premises of the argument are true. This means that the conclusion is also true. The universe has a cause. And since the universe can't cause itself, its cause must be beyond the space-time universe. It must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, uncaused, and unimaginably powerful, much like God. The cosmological argument shows that, in fact, it is quite reasonable to believe that God does exist.
So that was a modern version of the Kalam cosmological argument. What's changed is the evidence offered for the second premise, that the world, in this case the universe, has a finite past. There's a lot more evidence that can be used from modern science, modern cosmology, using Big Bang theory, and it was in the video. I'm a little bit skeptical in terms of using scientific conclusions for these sort of arguments, only because scientific conclusions are probabilistic. They can change at any time. But anyway, this continues to be a famous argument today, the Kalam cosmological argument. A good number of philosophers, mostly Christians, interestingly, are talking about this argument and debating this argument. But it was Muslims who sort of constructed it in its basic form. And it seems that today, 20th, 21st century, Christian thinkers have picked it up and made it their favorite argument. Now, whether one accepts the modern form of the argument or the medieval form of the argument, whatever one prefers, this is how the Kalam theologians of the Sunni tradition proved the existence of God to their satisfaction. So then the question is, what is the nature of this God? These Kalam thinkers argued that there can only be one cause of the world. There can't be two or three. The argument they gave for that was that if there were two or three gods, they would come into conflict with one another. The world would be in disarray. Therefore, there's only one God. Personally, I'm not really sure about how that argument really works, but that is what they use. Today, they appeal to Occam's razor, for example, that, well, we don't need to posit two causes of the universe, one will do. But either way, they have this idea that there's one God. But the bigger question now is, according to the Kalam theologians of the Sunni tradition, what is the nature of the one God? And here you will find different answers with some significant differences. So let's begin with the Mu'tazilis. Right? What's the Mu'tazili view of God? And I want to quote from some primary sources so you can really get a sense. And I'll use some visuals to try to capture what these ideas are. So here is a description of Mu'tazili beliefs. Now, the description is coming from Abu Hassan al-Ash'ari, but he's not being that biased here. He's sort of relating, this is what the Mu'tazilis, early Mu'tazilis believe regarding God. So according to the Mu'tazilis, God is one. There's nothing like God. He's not a body. He's not an object. He has no volume or form or flesh or blood. He's not physical. God is incorporeal. He cannot be described by any attributes which is applicable to creatures, to created beings. God is always knowing, willing, deciding, living. He never ceases to be those things. So there's certain qualities that God always has, right? Knowing, he's always willing, he's always living. God cannot be seen with the physical eyes. God does not derive any benefit or sadness or pleasure from anything, right? So God cannot be, God doesn't have emotions. God is not emotionally moved by anything that's going on. So, if somebody swears to God or insults God, someone chooses not to worship God, God is not moved by that. He's not going to get mad. He doesn't really have pleasure or anger. That's according to the Mu'tazilis. So the Mu'tazilis have a very transcendent idea of God. They negate a lot of physical, creaturely qualities from God. And they were known for that. They also have this idea, the Mu'tazilis have this idea, that God's essential attributes, so there are certain qualities, you could say, that God must have to be God. And according to the Mu'tazilis, God's essential attributes, they call these attributes, like power, knowledge, life, that these are not separate, eternal qualities that are attached to God. Rather, they are identical with God himself. Let me try to sort of explain with another quote. So, many people today, we would say that God is knowing. God is powerful. God is living. People say this. But that begs that sort of opens another question. Is God knowing? So how is God knowing? Does God possess knowledge that's sort of always with him? Or if God is powerful, if he's all powerful, does God possess a power that is always with him? Now, the Mu'tazilis said, according to this quote from an early Mu'tazili, Abu Hudayl, God is knowing through a knowledge that is identical to himself. He is powerful through a power identical to himself. He is living through a life identical to himself. What does this mean? It would basically mean that you have God's essence, this is God's self, so this is basically God, and God has certain attributes of essence, essential attributes, and these attributes, like that God is knowing, God is living, powerful, hearing, seeing, eternal, God is one, God is just, these attributes are not additional entities. So, in other words, God is powerful, but he doesn't possess a power that is different from himself. So God's power is God's essence. God's life is God's essence. God's justice is God's essence. And the same is true for sort of all of the essential attributes of God. the Mu'tazilis would say that God's essential attributes are identical to God's essence or God's self, God's being. They then further believe that there are other qualities that God has that are more like actions. So there are things that God is, and then there are things that God does. Whatever God is identical to God, but whatever God does is created. So God wills, God creates, God speaks, God rewards, punishes. So here's the thing. The Mu'tazilis, they call themselves the people of oneness because they really want God to be one and one only. They don't want any multiplicity in God. They don't want to say that God is eternal and God's knowledge is eternal. They don't want God's power to be an eternal alongside God. Why? Well, for them, it sounds too much like Christianity. It sounds like the Christian Trinity, where you have three eternal persons. The Mu'tazilis, they don't like that. They want there to be one eternal. So what they do is they say all of God's attributes, knowing, powerful, living, those are identical with God. And then they say that all of God's actions, creating, speaking, and so on, that these actions, they actually simply, they refer to the created product that sort of God produces. So for example, they would say that God's speech, which is the Quran or the Bible or whatever, that's created. They would say that God's reward is basically the reward that God creates for his creature. God's punishment is, the punishment that God creates. So for them, God's attributes of action, according to the Mu'tazilis, those refer to things that God creates. So for them, God's actions are all sort of things that God creates. In this way, the Mu'tazilis have only one eternal. There's only God, God's essence, because God does not have attributes that are distinct or separate from his essence. God's attributes are God's essence. That's the Mu'tazili view. They're very famous for this. So this is one interpretation of the one God. Now let's move, right, to a different perspective. Let's talk about the Hanbalis. And with the Hanbalis, we're going to get something very, very different. So you heard the Mu'tazilis, for them, God is not similar to his creatures. God doesn't laugh. God doesn't get angry. God is one, right? God. For the Mu'tazilis, God has no hands or face. So the Quran does talk about God's face, right? There's several verses that mention the face of God. If you ask a Mu'tazili, well, how do you explain that? They will say that face of God is just a verbal, metaphoric expression, and it just means God's essence. That's what they'll say. You might ask a Mu'tazili, well, the Quran mentions God's hand many times. What is that? What's God's hand? And a Mu'tazili might say, this is just a metaphor for God's power or, God's favors. God doesn't really have hands. God doesn't really have a face. That's what the Mu'tazilis would say. But when we go to the Hanbalis, we're going to get a very different perspective. So we'll begin with a quote attributed to Ahmad ibn Hanbal himself, and just take a read here of how he talks about God. It's very different. So he says that God hears, God sees, God knows, God is awake, God moves, speaks, observes, looks, laughs, joys, loves. God gets angry, God gets displeased. He says God comes down, descends every night to the lowest heaven. He says that God has fingers that he turns and he uses, that God has a hand, he created Adam with his hand. God has a foot, and God has a face. This is what Ahmad ibn Hanbal says. Now, if you ask him, why are you saying all this? He'll say, look, we have Quranic verses that talk about, Quran literally interpreted, it says God gets angry, and it doesn't say God laughs, but it says a lot of things about God that in a physical anthropomorphic sense sound like this. The Quran does mention God's hand and God's face and God's shin. It doesn't mention God's fingers, but the Hadith mention God's fingers. The Hadith mention God laughing and things of that sort. So this is what Ahmad ibn Hanbal would base his ideas on. This is a very anthropomorphic idea of God. Anthropomorphic in the sense that God appears sort of like a really powerful superhuman type figure, if you take this very literally. So later Hanbalis, like Abu Yala, they will work on this material and they'll systematize it, right? Because they're a Kalam school, they'll sort of systematize it, they'll interpret it, and they're going to come up with another model of God being one. So this is what Abu Yala would say. So for him, there's God's essence, is absolutely one, eternal, and so on. And he will say that God has attributes of essence, right? Essential attributes. But I've written it here in a certain way. So according to Abu Yala, God is living because God possesses an eternal quality or attribute called life. God is powerful because God's essence contains an attribute called power. God is speaking because there is an attribute within God's essence called speech. And it's the same for all these attributes. There could be many more of these attributes. I've only listed some here, but Abu Yala doesn't seem to indicate that there's a fixed number of essential attributes. So in God's essence, there are a multiplicity of divine attributes, and they're different from each other. So life is one attribute. Life is not the same thing as God's knowledge. God's knowledge is not the same thing as God's will, which is not the same thing as God's power. So what you have here for Hanbali thinkers is there's God's eternal essence, and in addition to God's essence, there are God's eternal attributes like life, knowledge, power, and so on. Abu Yala will also talk about God's actions. So God judges, God creates, God punishes, God provides, God forgives. And for Abu Yala, you should think of God's attributes of action as eternal as well. So for him, God is sort of eternally create. God is eternally the creator. God is eternally the judge. So for him, God's acts are eternal as well, according to this Hanbali thinker. And he will even say that you have to affirm that God has a face, that God has feet, that God has hands. Abu Yala will say that these are also attributes of God within his essence. He won't say that they are physical, though. So Abu Yala will say that, look, God has a face. It's not a physical face. It doesn't resemble a physical face, but he has some attribute that you have to call it God's face. And that's as far he'll go. But he won't metaphorically interpret what God's face means. He'll simply say, well, he has a face. The Quran says he has a face. We have to admit he has a face. So that's the sort of mature Hanbali approach. So here you have God's essence, which is eternal, and then you have God's attributes in the essence, essential attributes. Those are eternal. And then you have God's attributes of action, which are also eternal. So somebody might say there's one God, but there's multiplicity of eternal entities within or attached to God. And the Hanbalis would say, yeah, that is what we have. Now, these attributes are not persons, right? They're not independent entities, but they are distinct from each other. So you have a sort of multiplicity of eternals over here. Now we can look at the Asharis. They have, so here's a quote from Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. He's a famous Ashari Kalam theologian. He tells us that God has 7 attributes: knowing, powerful, living, willing, hearing, seeing, and speaking. So again, for Ghazali, God's attributes exist in God's essence, like you see here, right? But they are not, they're different from God's essence. That's what Ghazali says here. He says, so the maker of the world, God, is a knower with knowledge. So God has an eternal attribute called knowledge, which is in his essence. He has another attribute, eternal, called life. He has another attribute called power. So for Ghazali, there's 7. For others, there's about 8. I've sort of put 8 attributes here. But that's the general idea. So the Asharis they'll put a fixed limit on how many eternal attributes there are in God's essence. But they still say God has real attributes. These attributes are different from one another. God's life is not the same as God's knowledge. They're both eternal. So here you have, well, 7 or 8 eternal attributes plus God's essence, which is also eternal. So you have about 8 or 9 eternals in this system. And this is what Ghazali says. All the divine attributes are eternal. They subsist in God's essence. He goes on to say that therefore the names that are used for the attributes, those names are eternal. God is eternally called the living and the knowing and the seeing. He says there is some debate over God's acts, right? So that there are attributes of action that God has, according to Ghazali and other Ashari thinkers. And many of them think that God's acts are temporal, they're not eternal. So when God judges, God created at a point in time. God was not always creating, according to them, right? God is not always rewarding. So from what I've read anyway, most of the Asharis would say that God's attributes of action are temporal. They're not eternal. But God's attributes of essence, which about 7 or 8 of them, those are eternal. So you see, on this point, the Asharis seem to come in between the Hanbalis and the Mu'tazilis. They seem to have a middle position, and if you told them that, they'd probably be happy to hear that they have the middle position, because that's sort of what they aim at. So that's the view of the Asharis. Then you have the Hanafi-Maturidis. One more thing. So one last thing about the Asharis, which I want to clarify, which I want to say. If you ask the Asharis, are God's attributes, are they identical to God? They would give you this answer. The Asharis would say that God's attributes are not God's essence. They're not God, but they're not other than God. So again, the Asharis would say that God's attributes, the essential attributes, 7 or 8, they are not God, but they are not other than God. So God's attributes, like, they're not God, they're not created either. They're sort of, you could say they're somewhat in between, like they're not God, they're a bit lower than God, but they're not created. So that's their view on the attributes. And I'm mentioning this because when we look at the other school, the Hanafi-Maturidis, by the 12th century with Abu Mu'in al-Nasafi, the Maturidis have a very similar view as the Asharis. So Abu Mu'in Nasafi, he's a Maturidi thinker. He says that God has 2 kinds of attributes, essence and actions, same thing as before. He says the attributes of God's essence are life, power, hearing, seeing, knowledge, speech, and will. So very similar to the Asharis, right? There's about 7 or 8 eternal attributes of God's essence. He says God is eternal with all his names and attributes. The names and attributes of God are not he and not other than he. It's exactly what the Asharis believe. So when it comes to the attributes of God's essence, by this time, the Asharis and the Maturidis, they're almost on the same team on this point. The difference is this: for the Maturidis, God's attributes of action are eternal. So according to them, for example, God was always a creator. Before he created the creation, his state does not change. So for the Maturidis, God is eternally creating. God is always judging. God is always punishing. God is always rewarding. God is always forgiving. So God never ceases from his action, according to the Maturidis. That's where they differ from the Asharis, right? For the Asharis, God's actions are not eternal. They are temporal. So this was a lot. So now it's time. What we just did is we looked at the four Kalam schools' view of God, right? We looked at their proof of God, and then we looked at their view of God. And what we have here is we have at least four different models of the one God. That's what we have. What do they disagree on? They disagree on the nature of God's attributes of essence, and they disagree on the nature of God's attributes of action. They also disagree on what these attributes of essence are. One thing you'll notice is the Hanbalis, the Asharis, and these Maturidis, they would all put God's will and God's speech in the attributes of essence, eternal attributes. The Mu'tazilis put God's will and God's speech as God's attributes of action, which they see as created, right? So there's a disagreement over what the attributes of essence are, and there's a disagreement over whether the attributes of action are eternal or temporally created. That's right. So you have at least four models in Kalam of God, of the one God, among these schools. So now it's time for a little break. You know, it's a good time to take a break. You take our little quiz here. So first question, which of the following Kalam schools believes that God's attributes are identical to God's essence? And the answer would be the Mu'tazilis. The Mu'tazilis believe that God's attributes, God's life, God's power, knowledge, that they are identical to God's essence. Everybody else believes that they're not identical. They believe that the attributes exist in God's essence as distinct entities. That's what the others believe. The next question. Which of the following Kalam schools hold that God's attributes of action, God's acts, are eternal? And the answer would be the Maturidis and the Hanbalis. Right? The Mu'tazilis and the Asharis would say that God's attributes of action are temporal, are created, but the Maturidis and the Hanbalis would say that God's actions are eternal. So anyway, this is a good time, again, to sort of pause the video, take a break. We're done with Kalam. Now we're going to